I'm coming to them and saying, learn this entirely new way to write TypeScript. Trust me, bro, it'll be worth it. And it helps to like have some examples I can point to. And I think I recall one team member, the one actually with prior TypeScript experience, he trusted me enough to give it a try. And he said it really clicked for him when he was writing tests, actually, because he mocked some layer or wrote a test layer for some service. And he's like, oh, this is what I can do with this, and like isolate just certain services and test just the core business logic. And it's super helpful there. But that was the moment that clicked for him. I think we've all had sort of that moment, that it's just like, oh, this is what this is capable of. This needs to be sort of everywhere in our code base.
Welcome to Cause and Effect, a podcast about the TypeScript library and ecosystem called Effect, helping engineers to build production-ready software. I'm your host, Johannes Schickling, and I've been building with Effect for over 4 years. With this podcast, I want to help others understand the powers and benefits of using Effect. In this episode, I'm talking to Adam Rankin, CTO of Warp, a YC-backed payroll, payments, and HR platform for startups. In this conversation, Adam shares his path from Rails to TypeScript and how Warp incrementally adopted Effect across a single, fast-moving monolith. Let's get into it. Hey, Adam, it's so nice to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to learn more about Warp today. But before we talk about Warp, do you mind sharing more about who you are and a little bit of your background?
Sure. So I'm Adam. I'm the CTO of Warp. I came to Warp maybe 3 years ago, started it with the CEO who I actually met on Twitter. Before that, I've only ever worked at startups. I have experience building web apps of all sizes using mostly Ruby on Rails, and I trained as an engineer in school.
That is awesome. So you mentioning like most of your background being in Ruby on Rails. Can you already foreshadow a little bit of like how you went from Ruby on Rails to TypeScript? Did that happen at Warp? Did that already happen as sort of a prior role?
Sure. So I actually started my career in Ruby on Rails. I worked at a startup while I was in school who was building a web app on Rails. And I actually didn't know any other way to build a web app. It's a great experience, Rails. It's very opinionated. Ruby is a very sort of easy language to write. I like to say, if you know English, you know Ruby, because you're just kind of like guessing the method names and they exist. And then I actually sort of took a long break from it while I was writing some Python and various backend services for a bigger company, a banking company. And then when it came time to start Warp, we kind of were choosing our initial stack, and we were choosing something that could make us move as fast as possible and ship early features to customers. And at the end of the day, I basically Googled, what do people use in web apps nowadays? And it's like, okay, Next.js has some cool logos. Let's try this. And that's sort of how we started with TypeScript.
Got it. I actually want to linger a little bit more on that because I feel like that there is still some aspects about like Ruby on Rails is not bad. It is like, I'm not sure numbers wise. I wouldn't be surprised if it has more usage than ever before, just because like many people are building software in many different ways, right? I think like one of the like North Stars of like what developer experience can be like that I think in many regards, the TypeScript ecosystem has not been able to replicate, partially due to just the constraints of the language, but also like there's some like vibes and some like maturity and some like elegance of the ecosystem that I also think like kind of culturally is quite different in the JavaScript and TypeScript ecosystem. And while I don't agree with like all the perspectives that the Ruby on Rails creator DHH has, I still think that there's like very interesting ideas. So I'm curious whether you're still kind of like keeping up with the developments where it's like Ruby on Rails is going, whether you still can derive like some inspiration from that ecosystem.
I haven't kept up with the development lately. It's funny you say that because Rails is definitely lingering. It's definitely still strong. I feel like once a month, you find out like a new website or some new product that has billions of users or sorry, millions of users. And it's like, wait, they're on Rails? No way. So many like of these huge products started on Rails. And I think it's because it has so much out of the box that you need to run like jobs, for example. You pick up a TypeScript project and you're like, how do I queue up some background job and like respond to my user's API request? And in Rails, that's kind of trivial. In TypeScript, there's no opinionated way to do that. People are doing all kinds of different things. You have to kind of build your stack more and think about it. I think good DX tends to always win. That's why we see Next.js on Vercel winning. Rails is super easy and it kind of abstracts away the complications of doing a lot of infrastructure heavy activity. And I think that's something that the TypeScript ecosystem in general is behind on.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think from what you've mentioned about like the queuing system or like any kind of common canonical thing, yes, it is possible with TypeScript, but you like open 10 different blog posts that show you how is like, and you find 10 different ways. Whereas like in the Ruby and Rails world, like you have 10 blog posts and they all show you the same. Like there's just like in one world, you're kind of like at ease where you feel like, okay, like all roads lead to Rome. And like in the TypeScript world, it's like, wait, what? Like, no, this is like entirely different stack. Like, should I use that? Oh no, people like in Reddit say like it's dead. Should I use that? And it's just like it's a very different world. And I think there's like a lot positive to be said about that. Where like I think it's a richer place for different ideas to kind of like be explored at the same time. But there's also the kind of like confusion that, and sometimes even like paralysis of choice that comes alongside. And you see a similar thing also in other language ecosystems, Java obviously being a big one. But I think in Java, you have something like Spring, etc., that has more of like that Rails kind of coercion in one direction. And I think this is also for, if we're now bringing things back to effect, what we want to talk today about. I think this is also one of the big pieces of potential of effect. Yes, it gives you individual building blocks, but they all fit together in one holistic, cohesive way of building software that I think can actually bring a lot of the nice coherent aspects of something like Ruby and Rails or something of like Spring Boot to the TypeScript world. And so, yeah, and I think we're going to hear quite a lot about that today is like in the way how you're building work. So thanks a lot for sharing your background and like which twisted paths you've taken through the world of software development. Maybe before we dive into all things technical, can you share a little bit more about Warp? So you mentioned you started it together with a friend who you met over the internet 3 years ago. Like how quickly did things develop? Like I think today it's no longer just the two of you, but I believe like you raised a fairly big round recently. Can you share more about the company and maybe starting with what is Warp? What is the product and the goal of Warp?
Yeah, definitely. So we have sort of a funny origin story. I met the founder on Twitter in sort of this pseudonymous era where people were using like fake Twitters to sort of meet each other. And he had announced a project that he was working on. He had raised some money for. I thought it was cool. It was actually a consumer social app. So I had joined it and we kind of connected on there. And he had posted on there that he was looking for engineers, and I was sort of looking for my next thing at the time. So we actually met each other and agreed to work together before we knew each other's names. I always like to tell that story because it's super funny. I was visiting my parents at the time, and I was like, "Oh, I have sort of a job interview," and they were like, "With who?" And I was like, "I don't know his name, so I can't really tell you that."
And it
But
was at the peak of COVID as well, right?
yes, yes, this is like 2021. At the time, for some personal context, I was like kind of playing with the idea of starting my own thing. I had left my previous role. I was actually living a nomadic life. I was living in a different city every month. So I found this social app. I met the founder of it. We agreed to work together on this social app. It was Swift UI, AWS, Firebase. And when you build a consumer social app, you need to monetize it eventually. And there are only two ways to do that. And it's to get people to pay or to get people to see ads. And if you're not growing with some insane K factor, then you're not going to make any money on ads. So we ended up sunsetting the project and sort of going back to the drawing board and saying, what can we build? And again, this was mid COVID. We were using a competitor payroll product at the time. And our sort of insight was that, remote work is not going anywhere. There's a lot of compliance work in paying remote teams and paying people across the globe and across the country. There are thousands of tax jurisdictions. What if we could just take all of this off the plate of founders and build a payroll payments HR product tailor made for startups and founders? So that sort of was our initial insight. We joined YC and started, talking to startups and other small customers. It's like, what do you need? Let us handle it. And that's sort of how we got started. And our roadmap has sort of been built from there. We've built a lot of the table stakes features you need. And now it's very product driven by what people are requesting. And then sort of in conjunction with the whole COVID thing, the LLM revolution has sort of come along. So we're now exploring ways to be more AI native and use these things for automating different processes that we don't want to do and our customers don't want to do. So hopefully that's a good background on kind of how we started and what we do.
Oh, most certainly. And I want to make sure that we come back to the AI native automation part as well, as that's another key interest of mine currently as well. But I want to linger a little bit more on sort of your personal relationship to Warp as you went from building a consumer app to now building a software for other startups, etc. I guess much more B2B. And I think there is kind of two perspectives on how a startup founder can end up building something, either kind of out of love or out of frustration. What I mean with this, you love something so much, so you want to build something that's just fundamentally good and makes it even better, or you're so frustrated with an experience that you say okay, this needs to be solved. And I think you're falling into the latter. But I think what is tricky about that, as a founder myself, I had plenty of very frustrating experiences throughout my life where I felt, okay, there can be something better. But I also then pictured myself in a life where I'm now solving this problem for 10 years. And I would not derive a lot of joy out of becoming an expert at tax codes in France. I'm frustrated enough with barely trying to stay afloat with the German ones. So I'm just curious how your own perspective is sort of has evolved on that. I'm very glad you all are solving this. So I have a better experience not being exposed to that. But how you're finding your own balance of that frustration that you wanted to address, you're flying even closer to that sun of frustration to figure it out. Maybe you can just reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, it's a funny question because payroll, tax codes, it's the unsexiest thing you could probably imagine. It's B2B SaaS payroll. I have a few answers to that. I think one is the fact that not many people could imagine themselves doing it is sort of good for us because we're happy to kind of go in and get our hands dirty and let's figure out what needs to be done. And I think the actual joy of building a product comes from seeing a customer use it the right way, seeing a customer be satisfied and not have to worry. One joke we like to make is that we pride ourselves on least required user minutes. So we have some founders that have not logged into our product in months and it's just sort of running in the background for them. So we take a lot of joy in people not actually having to use our product because we've become experts in payroll and tax. And yeah, I definitely know more about payroll than I ever thought I would. But I think that, building a intuitive UX for something that's so boring, I think with sort of these unsexy industries, people come to expect unsexy and clunky products. And we're trying to change that. And that's really fun to me.
All right. Yeah, that definitely resonates. And sort of if you think about this is this delta between very frustrating experience without Warp to joy and delight and blissful ignorance of like all the stuff that needs to happen behind the scenes. Like if you can, yeah, the delta is probably pretty wide. So thank you for doing that work that no one else has to do it. So yeah, I don't want to get much closer to text codes, but I want to get a slight more intuition and context on like the people of building Warp. So I've mentioned that you all raised, I think, a Series A recently, and that allows you to continue to grow. So how many people are you currently in the company, and how many of those are engineers?
We have 16 people currently in the company, and our engineering team right now is 4. So we've kind of tried to remain small, even though we just raised a big round. We're hiring for all engineering roles. So if you're listening to this, joinwarp.com/careers. We like to move very fast and remain sort of nimble and kind of cut out processes. Yeah. So we've tried to remain small. We're very conscious of growing too fast, but also hiring.
That is awesome. And that definitely resonates. And like for, I think, a contemporary example of like who has done that really well for a long time is Linear, where like their tax code equivalent is task management. And they've built an like absolutely amazing, delightful experience for project management. And I think maybe you're thinking of yourself like being part of the same category of like next generational software. And the parallel I definitely want to like draw here is they've remained super, super small for a very long time in regards to engineering team. And you mentioning that you're still just 4 people, like I definitely applaud you for that. I think this allows you to just have like a velocity and an agility that is hard to match when you're growing and growing in terms of the engineering team. I think at some point that is inevitable, but like remaining small and like keeping the bar high for engineering talent, I think is definitely the way to go. So maybe you can share a little bit more on like the background of the other engineers. How like when we are now drawing a bridge to effect, which has not too many similarities with Ruby and Rails in that regard. That is like more coming from like the functional programming world, even though that is not like the core essence of effect these days. This is where it had its origin story and still draws a lot of people to effect, and it requires a little bit of like a entry ticket to learn a few new things. So I'm curious, like what was sort of like the catalyst event for Warp getting on board with effect?
Yeah, I guess to say a bit about our early team, I mentioned Rails. One of our other core engineers came from a huge product running on Rails and React, and our other team members have come from big Python world, especially the guy who's good at AI has written a lot of Python. And then the last member, I guess I can just enumerate the whole list since it's small. He was a new grad, so he was actually very interested in Rust and systems programming languages. So not actually much TypeScript before we started Warp. I think that the way, if I could tell the story of how I first came across Effect, was that I'm in sort of these online circles that expose me to things way out of anything I need to write B2B SaaS payroll software. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of these communities that they're like heavy systems programmers. You'll find some very like eccentric people writing like the craziest software. I'm very interested in like type systems in general, and I was writing a lot of random side projects in Haskell. And I always love that experience, but like I just couldn't justify for the business like starting to write something in Haskell. It would be like such a big learning curve for people. It would be like, how do we deploy this thing? How are we gonna like build our entire pipeline around this? And can't justify that when you're trying to just ship features. But anyway, back to how I found Effect. I think it was in these circles, like some of these guys obsessed with type systems are like, why would anyone ever use TypeScript? It sucks. Like only Effect is like doing something decent with it. And I'm like, okay, like take that with a grain of salt, but file it away for later. Kind of go to the Effect docs eventually. A bit daunting, like, all right, what is this? What is this thing on TypeScript? And eventually, sort of through osmosis, and seeing like code snippets of people, especially like the Vercel team posts a lot. I'm like, okay, this could be nice. And then looking for sort of some project to start it with, some excuse to write with effects. And finally, we had some little proof of concept, very isolated from our product that we were going to build. It was actually an AI browser agent. So it was automating browser actions and computer use with AI. And I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm going to use Effect for this. And that's sort of my first experience. It was very slow going. There is definitely a learning curve. And that's sort of the impetus. And I guess I can mention sort of too why I was even ready for something like Effect. We like started early on TypeScript, as I mentioned, because it was just like the easiest way to get started. You can move very fast, and it's very optimized for like happy path coding. It's like, you know, those old TVs with the antennas on top. You like hit it a bunch of times, and eventually it like starts working. It's like static, and you just hit it. That's how it feels like coding in TypeScript or in JavaScript without like proper result types and dependency injection. It's just like, okay, this error happened. Let me like add some conditional for that. And then like eventually like 1,000 times later, you have like something that works and you're way too scared to touch it again. That's how it feels like coding in vanilla sort of TypeScript, JavaScript. So I'm like, all right, this is like just not sustainable. We have a product where, you know, everything has 5 or 6 different states it could be in, statuses. And then there's like, say 20 objects with 20 different statuses. Like it's just an exponential amount of different statuses things can be in.
It's a lot of antennas that you need to slap just right.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. So I'm like, I need something that can do this better. And so that's why I was like very receptive initially to Effect.
So this is one analogy I make quite a bit is sort of like the a sugar high versus eating vegetables. Like building something quickly. This is like, I mean, JavaScript is like perfect at that. But then like when you like run into those problems where in production you see undefined is not a function and you have no clue where this might even happen. Maybe the stack trace is like buried somewhere, like some esoteric place, and you're just like completely lost. And it kind of like dawns on you, yes, I should have eaten more vegetables. I should have built this the right way. But now to kind of like get from place A to place B, where like you're currently in undefined is not a function place, and you're in that place where everything is nicely modeled, like that can be quite daunting. So you've taken the plunge with the AI browser automation project. Can you share a little bit more of like what that looked like? What were you trying to, did you build that from scratch? Did you have like a existing version that has worked in happy path land, but you now want to make production ready? Or like take me through like the adoption journey of Effect for that particular project, and how did you involve your other team members?
So this project was very, very isolated. It was a from scratch product. We haven't done anything like that before. It was sort of R&D, just kind of going out, seeing if this would work. And actually in hindsight, like that was probably not the right place to start with Effect, because we were just trying to build a proof of concept. But I was like so dead set on improving our workflows that I was trying to, you know, use this thing I wanted to use. You know, startups are great because you can just kind of choose your tech stack as you go along and try things out. You're not like constrained to other internal libraries or anything. So I was super excited to try it there, even though it wasn't the best fit. I was using this library called Stagehand from BrowserBase that kind of integrates with different AI providers and reads sort of the DOM to extract actionable things on any web page and then act upon them. So I was just kind of like wrapping functions with effects and like seeing how it worked. Like, how does this dependency injection thing work? So that's sort of how it got started. I was actually working on that project pretty much alone. And then we built out the proof of concept. We're like, this can work. We're going to productize it later, but I need to go back to like building product. So it was sort of a decent amount of time between that experience and, all right, we need to get this into our product. And I think the sort of thing that pushed me was actually hiring new people. We have this like mess of of old happy path code in some places that needs to be like more productionized. And part of it is like an ego thing. Like, oh, I have to show this code to someone else. I have to like someone else has to work on this. We
You
need
need
like
to
better
clean
ones.
up before your friends arrive.
Exactly, exactly. I'm like, how can I expect like a new team member or like
Oh,
five new team
I
members
know the feeling. This is like
to
you
contribute
onboard
to
someone,
this?
like it works the right way, but like you gotta clean it up now. Yes.
Yeah. So that's when we were sort of like, all right, we need a better developer experience. We need everything to be more testable, everything, all the errors enumerated. It's like sit down and sort of, if we were in an ideal world, what would our stack be? That still allowed us to move very fast and allowed people to onboard quickly and write both front end and back end very quickly. And we sort of came up with that answer and we were like, all right, let's just go for it.
And just to share sort of like one anecdote I've heard from a couple of other companies who are using Effect, that it's actually interesting that they also hired people with no prior TypeScript experience. And this was sort of like the first time really where someone went super deep on TypeScript and went right into Effect. As like me as a Effect team member, this felt initially kind of counterintuitive because I came to Effect because I've done TypeScript for like a decade, suffering through the limitations of TypeScript. And then I saw Effect as the answer to that. But I've already learned of like all of like those mishabits of like holding it this particular way that like tribe knowledge has just been passed down to you. But people outside of the TypeScript ecosystems, they've never been burdened with all of those like crafty experience. Like you're using this way not because it's particularly nice, but just because you have to do it this way. But if you're new to TypeScript and new to Effect, then like you're learning it the right way right away. And weirdly enough, it's actually easier to learn Effect if you don't have that year's worth of like using TypeScript already in this particular way. And so that really resonates now.
Well, it is almost like writing or reading a new language. Like you never really use generators in like your day to day TypeScript. Like you'll never see that in a React app, and then the type signatures are just completely different from something you'd write yourself.
Yeah. And I think that's the most useful mental model that you can give like a newcomer, being unburdened from like things before. Yes, the type signatures, etc. Like I think that's helpful to have an understanding of that. But I think this is actually one of the most elegant parts about TypeScript, how nice the inference works. But then sort of like to absorb the the mental models of the concepts, etc. Like if your brain is not constantly racing of like trying to bind it to a prior TypeScript thing you've been using, but just like absorbing that in a more like free world, I think that's actually can work super well. And I think this is seems to work super well for people with prior Rails experience, and also for that new grad you've mentioned coming more from a Rust background, since I think Effect is actually the closest thing to Rust we have in TypeScript in terms of like applying systems programming mindset and rigor to TypeScript.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Going back a bit to writing Haskell. There's this meme in Haskell where if you pass the type check, then your code works. In vanilla like JavaScript and TypeScript, I heard someone joke one time that TypeScript is a VS Code extension, and that's really funny to me because types are just suggestions there. They're not actually real guarantees. And effect is sort of the layer that makes it feel like my type is a real thing. I can actually trust that this thing here is this thing it says it is. It goes so far in writing production ready code.
Yeah. So as you then like introduced Effect into like that first R&D project, and then you brought it to the rest of the system, walk me through how you cleaned up before new people joined, and how did Effect step by step? How did you migrate your project step by step?
I guess we started with sort of asking the question, how can we do this incrementally? And the first place we sort of used it was we're using these NoSQL stores in some places. And we were like, all right, let's try to use schema and just the general effect dependency injection to try to more strongly type some of these NoSQL stores we're using and see if we can like parse out our data. We were using like a lot of places, just, let's get this basically document object and like just write as thing at the end of it. And then it's like that thing. And we run into tons of issues doing that with that's that happy path coding. So let's schema parse all of these. Let's like be sure we have the things we say we have. And that sort of led us to starting to wrap our like database drivers and our like various domain objects in schemas and contexts. And then we're like, you know what? Let's just like forget that. Like forget trying to like rewrite old stuff. Let's just come up with our new stack and write it. And so we actually completely wrote a new server. It's funny the way it worked, because the other sort of DX improvement we were looking to get was we wanted to write less hooks on the front end. We wanted open API specs so that we could just generate all of our front end code. So we're looking at different ways to do that. We eventually found, the effect platform thing. We're like, all right, let's take our existing API and write the HTTP group endpoints that match like what our API is. And then we can generate our hooks from that. And then we go deeper and we realize, oh, we don't need to generate anything. Effect can just like infer the entire HTTP client. So we'll do that. And then we're like, you know what? Why would we rewrite the old things when we already have the hooks for them? Like, let's just actually implement our new API endpoints through the effect platform. And then, so we kind of incrementally, after implementing one thing in each place, we were like, you know what? Like, let's just write the whole thing end to end in effect and like start pulling in like entire flows from the legacy code into our like sort of new stack. And that's sort of how we've been going about it. We use RPC to sort of interface from our old backend to our effect backend. And that's sort of the bridge where we need to like make a call for a new service or a new context. It is like somewhat of a friction point to add random effects in non-effect code, because you do like the run sync, you have to add all the dependencies basically right there. And then you have to handle all the errors before you're back in like the world where you don't know anything. It's a bit more verbose, but I actually somewhat prefer it, because as we sort of adopt more and more, the sort of scope of that initial run sync just grows and grows. And then it's like, okay, now we just have everything's effect. So that's sort of how it's been going. I know that was kind of convoluted, but hopefully answers the sort of adoption path for us.
No, it definitely resonates. And I think it shows sort of, I don't think there is like the canonical adoption experience for effect. I think it always kind of depends on your particular pain points. That's typically what I would recommend to people when they look into effect. I wouldn't recommend them doing one big bang migration where they don't ship any new features and just migrate everything. And that drags on for a very, very long time. I would rather recommend doing it incrementally, where you can start it one day and like in the same day you ship the first version of effect, and that touches just a small part of the code base, but then like you've gained sort of that incremental confidence that you can do that without maybe your colleagues even knowing. And step by step, for the code that you own, you can clean it up and make it more like a home. And then over time, you will realize that it can absorb a lot of the manual code you've written before. And by embracing more parts of effect, you can delete a lot of the code. And then also there is some gluey stuff that you have while you're still sort of in the adoption process. And that's fine. Like that, you don't need to ever move beyond that. But if you then start adopting even more effect, then even those parts become just like seamless, like sort of the seam becomes seamless where you interact with effect, and then you have like a single entry point. And I think this is really like where, when I went first through that, it's like, oh my gosh, this just felt so good, like how everything feels so coherent. And the last time I had that experience, I think, was like migrating a giant jQuery code base to React. And once that was completed and I could just like delete the jQuery dependency, that felt sort of like a similar step. Think back to the time when you onboarded more of your engineering colleagues and like you exposed them to effect. How did you take them by the hand and sort of like showed them around and helped them build an intuition?
I probably sounded a bit like a crazy person at the time. If they hadn't heard of Effect, I hired them, one with prior TypeScript experience, one the new grad with none, and then basically he got a bunch of TypeScript experience, and then I sort of come to them and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, we need to rewrite everything, basically. Like, everything, Effect works best when it's like end to end. It has a way of just like sucking up more and more. We joke now that, like, oh, another day, like I was reading through source code or like deep in the Discord and I found another primitive that's in this library that just like works perfect for us. So, side note, there's a lot of work to be done to like get a lot of these effect primitives and sub packages to have more documentation and get more people to know about it.
I think this definitely resonates because effect is such a vast ecosystem, and it's sort of like the along the lines of the saying like the gift that keeps on giving. But I think it's all about having the right mindset. Since like you could with one perspective look at it as like, oh, such a vast ecosystem, so many things to learn, and you could be paralyzed by saying like, oh, this is too much. I won't even get started. What I think is much more helpful is like picking a few abstractions of effect, not even bothering about the existence of the others, and like starting to adopt it. And you'll be surprised how great this will already feel. And then step by step, once you have an understanding and an intuition for how these pieces work, then you're in the right spot to appreciate the next abstraction and have that sort of like improve everything in the same way as if we see how other ecosystems and languages have evolved over the years. Something like React hooks, they solve particular pain points that existed before. But if they would have been introduced like that in the beginning, maybe that would have been too overwhelming. So if you fully adopted effects throughout your system, then there's still another incremental adoption dimension where you can start refactoring things with more effect primitives that you realize, oh, this is actually a great fit. And I think with that, it's all about modeling your system.
Right. And once you start sort of thinking in effect, you start having these ideas like, oh, what if I wrapped this service this way or like abstracted this thing this way? And you come to realize that the ecosystem has already done that. And here's the thing that does it. And you're like, oh, this is actually perfect. I don't need to like even write anything. I can just use this. One example recently was just simply caching any network call like on Redis. And we were like about to write a wrapper for just calling an effect that calls some other service and first checking the cache in Redis. And then we found the tag requests and it's just like, oh, just add a cache key and like provide the Redis layer or whatever. And it's like, oh, these things already exist. It's back to the way Rails is sort of very opinionated. It's the way that Effect has this giant ecosystem. It's moving more towards these are the ways we should do things. And it's almost even better because you can implement a layer any way you want. So it's not as opinionated. It's just you have the building blocks for what you need. It's like building with Legos, but it's almost even better than that because when you build with Legos, you can't like enter in the center and rip out a piece and like replace it. But with Effect, you can rip out any layer and replace it with anything else at any time as long as it like matches the service.
Exactly. And I think this is sort of hinting at the amazing concept of composability. And like when we say we're talking about Legos, is like that we can click them together, we can compose them. And there is sort of like the atomic or subatomic level of like you can't get smaller than that. But everything else is kind of composed out of those. But then you have like those like more macro structures that are already useful and you can use them but you can also at any time like kind of take those apart and like have the little Legos that make the big Lego. And I think this is what you rarely have in those larger ecosystems like Ruby and Rails. This is where basically you get the big thing, and if it doesn't do what you want, well, bad luck. You got to roll your own from scratch. Whereas with Effect, you can very elegantly kind of like take those things apart and tweak them to your liking.
Yeah, I guess back to your earlier question about introducing it sort of to the team and whether they were apprehensive. They definitely were. There's a learning curve, and we're always just trying to ship as fast as possible. We have pressure from customers and product guys just to ship as fast as possible. Like, let's have this out tomorrow. So I'm coming to them and saying, learn this entirely new way to write TypeScript. Trust me, bro, it'll be worth it. And it helps to like have some examples I can point to. And I think I recall one team member, the one actually with prior TypeScript experience, he trusted me enough to give it a try. And he said it really clicked for him when he was writing tests, actually, because he like mocked some layer or wrote a test layer for some service. And he's like, oh, this is what I can do with this, and like isolate just certain services and test like just the core business logic. And it's super helpful there. But that was the moment that clicked for him. I think we've all had sort of that moment, that it's just like, oh, this is what this is capable of. This needs to be sort of everywhere in our code base.
Exactly. And I'm considering those sort of like the superpowers of Effect. And you can also turn around those superpowers into like super tricky problems when you like those being error handling, those being observability, testing, concurrency, etc. Like if your app doesn't meet those yet, great. And like if you're in that position, like Effect might make less sense for you. But the moment you need those, and even more if you combine those, then you're in a really tricky spot. Like let's say you want to test your app. Okay, that's hard. But now you want to test your app for particularly tricky error scenarios that you don't know how to kind of like induce into your system. Like trying to do that without Effect, then you basically just spend like so much time building your app, and you spend so much time just building this crazy mocking system that like tries to simulate everything, and you probably feel like, do we really need that test? And it just disincentivizes good software engineering. And I think this is what Effect really flips. So there's always a breaking point. For some it's error handling, for some it's testing. And I think you just need to like walk someone to that problem, and then I think it starts to click.
Yeah, exactly. This composability, interestingly, has actually been great specifically for payments. You have like all these different payment rails and all these different like providers, and you can just write one common interface, and the usage code doesn't care about what rails the payment's going on. You can change the rails. You can dynamically route the payment rails just by like providing a different service, providing a different layer. So it's been super interesting to see the patterns we can develop this way.
Can we shift gears a little bit and talk a bit more about like the architecture of your system? So like if I'm going to joinwork.com, like there's a website, and probably next to the website, there's also some sort of like dashboard that your customers are using. So that dashboard, I suppose you're using something like Next.js for that. So there's a front end at minimum, but that front end is then talking to some sort of like API tier. So we have that as well. But I'm curious, what else is there? Is there like, do you have an API level? But then you probably also have places, maybe you have cron jobs, maybe you have like other things you've mentioned, like that AI agent browser setup, etc. So I'm not sure whether you're thinking about this as like microservices or majestic monolith, but like maybe you can explain a little bit of like how that. Imagine we're at a whiteboard and you're drawing the system architecture. Like maybe you can do that in words.
We definitely prefer to keep things as simple as possible. We're a team of 4, and we don't have high requirements for like latency on requests. We have requirements for reliability, being payment software. Another thing is we don't have a high total number of like daily active users. So our compute requirements are actually interestingly somewhat low. That being said, the way we started was on Next.js, and almost everything was just in a Next.js API route. That grew honestly way past its usefulness, but that's the way things go at startups. You just pick a stack. That's been the theme of this whole interview. You pick a stack, you go too far with it. It doesn't meet your needs.
And also, just as a side note, it's almost diametrically opposed to what you've been building before with the social network, where like it's like the latency really matters, etc. And like now you've like completely flipped all of your like tech trade-offs.
Yeah, that one was fun to build because it was tons of caching, streaming, like all the stuff that needed to scale very quickly when there was a usage upburst for whatever reason, and now our usage patterns are a lot more predictable. If you think about it, people log in to see their paycheck twice a month. We just need to like get that part right and then make sure all the payments are right. So I guess to say more about the infrastructure, we're running containers. We have one monolith pretty much that handles all of our API routes, jobs, even like, yeah, asynchronous jobs, cron jobs. And that's our Effect platform API. And then we do have like separate services, for example, for the browser agent thing. We have a Slack bot that's separate, that's like sufficiently different to necessitate another service. But all that to say, pretty simple. We like to work in a monolith.
And is that monolith currently deployed in a single place? Or are you already running that in a distributed setting that maybe you have one running in the East Coast, one running on the West Coast, wherever your customers are?
Yeah, we just have one running on the East Coast that's next to our database.
Got it. So maybe at some point there might be the day on the horizon where you need to like go multi data center, which I'm sure will upend a whole bunch of like so far trade-offs you didn't have to make yet. But this is another thing where maybe I'll invite you back to the podcast to see whether Effect workflows could help with that, since this is exactly what this is about. Kind of like to like going with a monolith and just deploying that monolith to a single place is the simplest you can go with. And I love simplicity, but at some point you might need to go beyond that. And then to still go for maximum simplicity, I think this is where Effect will be another gift we'll be receiving from Effect, is like Effect workflows that try to help exactly with this sort of thing. But we'll talk more about that in the future.
Yeah, I hope to make it there. I hope to have these problems.
But maybe going back to that, so you mentioned like you're running this right now in a container. You mentioned that you run some sort of like jobs, background processes, etc. How do you orchestrate that right now? Is that still mostly driven through, what are the entry points? Are those entry points are requests? Or those entry points might be cron jobs? Anything else that sort of serves as an entry point to kick off code that runs?
Yeah, so we have the HTTP like sort of RESTful API that kicks off code, where we actually wrapped BullMQ with some Effect helpers. So that's the way we're kind of queuing up jobs and processing them. We're still running that just on one server. All the handlers, we could distribute that somewhat simply. And then, yeah, there's also RPC endpoints just for calling more service type functions from our legacy backend. That's pretty much it. I guess to mention cron, we can queue like cron type jobs in our BullMQ. So we're not officially using like cron jobs, but it's daily scheduled jobs.
Got it. Can you share a bit more about sort of like the DevOps lifecycle things that you're dealing with, and how you're using Effect for that part of the picture as well?
One thing I didn't mention is that we're using Bun in our container runtime. So that's been fun. Effect pretty much abstracts that away. So it's no different than using it in Node, other than we get to say we're running on Bun, and it's fun and a bit faster. There are some Bun features that we like. Yeah, I guess we're fully automated like deployments. We just, build the container in a GitHub action with Bun and PNPM, and then push it to our like ECS cluster running on AWS.
Got it. Speaking of sort of like the monolith and bun approach, a friend of mine has been working at Midjourney. And I think Midjourney actually has also embraced the sort of architecture and deployment architecture where they have like one big machine where they're running their monolith through bun. And I think they call it the mother bun. So just a little fun side note here. But speaking of Midjourney and therefore AI, you mentioned initially that one theme that you're currently also spending quite a lot of time on is automating things further with AI. So maybe we can pivot the conversation a bit in that direction. Do you want to give an overview of like what that means and then diving closer into that?
Definitely. The way I think about AI in our product is sort of two separate kind of verticals. We are a payments product. We, remit taxes. We have to know all the taxes and we have to get those right. So you think that plus AI is probably a recipe for disaster. But I think there are sort of two ways we think about it. One is the customer facing way, which is, we've built this wonderful platform for people to use. How can we make AI to one, make that easier to use? And two, I think one common theme that's going on right now is just meeting customers where they are, which for many means building a Slack bot, chat interfaces, et cetera. So how can AI actually be the bridge between our end users and our product in a way that's like very safe and human in the loop? And, we're not triggering payments for people that aren't approved, but we can actually use our product with natural language. And I guess when I say AI here, I'm talking about LLMs specifically. And then sort of the other way we're thinking about it is automating process heavy workflows sort of on the back end, which is, what if an AI can file taxes? What if an AI can like read your tax reports and, generate insights and go and sort of do the things that need to be done. And these are things that in the pre 2023 era, you might have needed an army of employees or contractors to like go through these, convoluted .gov websites and click through these things. But we're sort of asking the question, what if a person doesn't actually have to do that? So those are sort of the different ways we're sort of thinking about it.
Got it. That is super helpful. So in regards to the latter, automating those various like manual processes, when you mentioned that currently Warp is 16 people, four of them being engineers, I suppose like a big chunk of the other employees are still doing that sort of like making the entire thing happen behind the scenes. But there is, as you scale up your customers, you would need to scale up the employees. So you want to like automate as much as possible. And this is where AI like is helpful.
Yeah, exactly. The economics of it, I mean, is that we have to scale our team somewhat linearly with the number of customers we have. But with AI, you can presumably pay pennies for things that you'd have to hire a bunch of people for. So but we're exploring different ways to do that.
Got it. And now is like a great opportunity for your existing employees who've been doing that so far, like help in that automation process as they're the domain experts. And yeah, that sounds fascinating. It like gets us a full circle back to the initial point of like, we can be thankful to you like doing that. And now it's actually super fun for the people who were the domain experts that they can now like start being included in the automation process. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's its whole like different topic of like what it means to like do that automation. And there's like a lot of like just from my own experiments and like work on AI driven things, there's like so many things that can just go wrong. I mean, if you're just like as a human navigating websites, like things just rarely are going as they should. There's like a downtime, there's like whatever, like a page just reloads without you triggering it. There's just so many unpredictable things.
Or sometimes they don't use HTML selects and reading the DOM, you have no idea what to like. There are accessibility issues that an AI can run into. There are so many things.
Yeah, so this is it's whole different kind of worms, and like honestly, it becomes like a whole different profession of like how to build systems that like can automate these things that we have in mind. But maybe we focus a little bit more on the first part you've mentioned, where where you meet people where they are and like expose sort of like those more AI native interfaces to them. Are you also building those systems with effects? And maybe you can also share a bit more of like how those are built, which sort of effect primitives they're using.
Yeah, we are using effect for it. We haven't actually used the effect AI thing. I've wanted to use that, but I guess our team member who's doing it is, like I said, came from the Python world, and it's very like fast iteration cycles. He was kind of fighting the learning curve of learning effect versus trying to get features out. So we haven't explored that specific primitive too much. We are using effects sort of in the same way we've just wrapped like the providers. We're only using one LLM right now, which I'll refrain from naming, but you could guess. Yeah, sort of the same way, just end to end, like wrapping workflows. There's very much human in the loop sort of things, and we have to ask on a lot of workflows like for confirmation from the user. So there's these like very stateful flows. So we're actually using sort of effect and TypeScript more generally to kind of pick up these workflows where they left off and write like these stateful flows.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's always like a good judgment call to see like, hey, is using effects here today, is that solving a problem we have? Or would it potentially, if I pay that learning cost, is it worthwhile paying that today? Or should I pay it in 2 months from now when I have more acute problems? That's always a good question to ask. And I think that starts adding up. But rest assured that Effect AI has become a lot more polished, and I use it relentlessly in many projects, and it's an absolute joy.
Oh, I'll have to explore it deeper. Yeah, like you mentioned, it's hard to justify when one, the person doesn't know it, and two, when you don't know what your data is going to end up looking like, and you don't know if the project will even survive. So there is this, back and forth between like, is the learning curve worth it versus I need to ship features.
Yeah. So maybe looking a little bit more into the future, what are your hopes for Effect as an ecosystem? And what are your plans for Warp from an engineering perspective?
Good question. I think I've been super happy with the stuff we're building. It's been like such a refreshing experience building the new way that whenever I'm like digging deep into legacy code, I'm just like upset in general. I'm like ashamed of what I've written in the past in some ways. So I'm super excited. I'm very excited for a lot of the things that are marked experimental to just be like production ready, so to speak. Like super excited for more things like the AI package. And also, like I mentioned, I think there's so many opportunities to get a lot of the ecosystem in better like documentation states. There are so many like Discord threads with gems that the person coming to Effect for the first time will never see for the thing that they need. I think I'm excited for it to be in more of the LLM training data. I've seen a lot of, they spin their wheels because they don't know the syntax or whatever. They don't know a specific diagnostic error. The LSP extension helps a lot with that. So really, I'm just excited for it to hit the mainstream more. And I'd like to, do anything I can to support that. There's a lot of opportunities for educational content. I see a lot of your team, to their credit, posting like animations and different things. So I'm super excited for the direction it's going. And I think the Effect team has been great. And a lot of the projects I see written in it are really cool. I think a lot of the people I respect are writing it. And that's sort of reason enough to try it.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for sharing your own experience with Effect today and sharing your super interesting story of like how you've come to co-found Warp. I think it's very inspiring for the audience to show like how a few engineers you can build like a global system that solves like really material problems. And that's exactly what Effect is built for. And it's very cool to see that it's working well for you.
Yeah, we're super happy with how it's turning out. And if anyone listening wants to write Effect, come join Warp.
Please do. Yeah, we're gonna put the link in the show notes. And yeah, Adam, thank you so much for taking the time today and sharing your story.
Yeah, it was great to join. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
That sounds great. All right. Thank you for listening to the Cause and Effect podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. If you haven't done so already, you can join our Discord community. And if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions about this episode or about Effect in general, don't hesitate to get in touch. See you in the next episode.